Now I'm going to switch to a 3H pencil from a 4H. And I'm going to start to put a little bit more shading into this. What I'm seeing is there's a little shadow along this edge because of the thickness of the leaf. This side gets quite a bit of shadow except for the edge where we see the thickness of the leaf. And this whole panel here becomes much darker than this one, although this one will have some gradation from the midrib out to the edge of the blade where it generally gets lighter. So we're going to try to hold on to this light area here, put a little bit of darkness along the edge, and then put a little gradation a little bit along the midrib, but not too drastic, because we can always go back in later. And my suggestion is, because you do see a little venation in this, is that you move the value in the direction of the venation, not actually drawing it in, but just making the strokes for your pencil follow that venation. It becomes just a very subtle change to the leaf. Now, as we get down to the tip of this leaf, it curls a little bit. So we're going to make the bottom end of this leaf considerably darker, and it might take several steps to do that, but know that you can add a bit more layering down at the bottom end of the tip. You would have to take your time and really control what's going on. Here we see a very thin line. I'm going to add just a very thin line. And the whole side of this leaf is considerably darker, so we can add a lot of value to this side. But do it gradually so you can control just how much that value will affect the light or darkness of that leaf. You can see as I darken this area how much lighter this midrib gets. So at some point I'm going to put more darkness on this side, a little bit more darkness, and then eventually I'm going to go back in and I'm going to put a little bit more tone in that midrib, because this right now looks like it's too bright. But we're going to leave it that way until we have more of our values in place, so that we can judge the relationship of the darks and lights with each other before we go too strongly into one area. Now I've put in my first layer of dark shadows, but now I'm going to go back even more because I can see that it still needs to be darker still. So this is another layer of number 3 that I'm putting on here. So now it's time, at least on this side, to go to a softer pencil. So I'm going to go from 3H, I'm going to go down to 2H. Again, the pencil's got to be very sharp, and we're going to start it to put in some more darks. But you can see, because I built this from a 5H down to the 2H at this point, we're getting nice even tone. We're not getting any fluttering in the darks, so that all of the paper is evenly filled in and you're getting good value. All right, I'm going to leave this area the way it is for the time being, because you can see how strong now this midrib is, and it shouldn't be anywhere near this bright based on what the subject looks like. So I'm going to go back into this side now, but not with a 2H pencil. I'm going to go back to my 4H pencil, and I am going to tone in not only this area here, but I'm also going to put another layer of value on the midrib, just to bring it back a little bit so that it doesn't stand out so much. But you need to make sure that as you're doing this, that you put value into the entire blade on that right side, so that that blade gets darker along with the midrib. In this area here, we have quite a bit of highlight, so I'm going to blend some of this so that we're not going to lose the brightness in certain areas of this blade. And now as this blade goes down towards the tip, it starts to get darker. So we'll put a little bit more graphite in that area just by going over it a few times. And eventually we'll switch down to a 3H so that this side comes closer to what's happening on the left side of the leaf. Now what I'm going to do at this point is I am going to take a 2H pencil and I am going to put in the shadow that exists on this side of the blade. And in some areas it's going to be like a disappearing line or a weighted line, because closer to the highlight area, this edge is going to be bleached out a little bit. You would have to look at your blade and see what it does. And where it seems to blend into the blade, I'm going to put a little bit of gradation into that edge. And it's a very quick gradation because the area next to it is going to be quite light. Now I'm going to go back to my 4H pencil, or maybe I'll even go to a 3H, and I need to put in a little bit more gradation into this side of the leaf, working with the direction of the veins so that you suggest them but not make them overt. You see how much more subtle the midrib is at this point. I'm going to go back to the dark side of this leaf, and I'm going to put an overall tone, darker tone, using the 3H pencil over this whole side, because I think that it needs to have more contrast with the opposite blade. It's just that at this point you must be careful that you go over the whole area without leaving anything out, because you need to tone everything so that everything stays light where it needs to stay light and gets dark where it needs to get dark. As you get down to this end of the blade, it's no longer a thin vein. It's really just a different edge between light and dark because the vein has gotten so thin that it doesn't show. Now there's a little bit more shadow along the rib here. Because the blade does tend to curve a little bit, and that will account for that little extra darkness. Now on this side, there's quite a bit of highlight, so I'm going to lift some of that out of here. Clean my kneaded eraser. Now I'm just delicately touching the graphite, and then what I'll do is go back in or run some dark in among these edges so that the highlight comes out a little bit more. Right, I have this leaf pretty much to the darkness I think it needs to be, but I may end up going darker still depending on how the rest of these leaves start to develop. So getting back to the subject that I'm using here as an example of how to go about rendering leaves on space, the lighting in this case really demanded that I used more darker shapes in the background because of cast shadows, because of the light hitting in certain ways. So in fact, this is somewhat of a combination of the two. But what it does is it gives you this feeling of depth because of the change in the values based on what seems to be in front and how you can produce shadows that help to create a certain amount of distance between this leaf and this leaf. And yet here, where this leaf was totally in shadow, it's totally dark compared to the leaf in front. Now, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done on this rendering, but it gives you a sense of how to go about approaching the values for a leaves in space subject. You'll note that there's a lot more detail in these front leaves. There's hardly any detail other than midrib and this leaf, which is farthest behind and foreshortened. There's no detail other than the shadow value in these two leaves. And these leaves here will have similar detail to what's happening with this frontal leaf right here. You can already see how we're getting some depth. So that's what you need to do.